thanks to everyone for being here. And thank you for your great work. I think what is energizing people around Minnesota, especially in the state legislature and even our congressional delegation, is that so many people in communities and civic leaders around Minnesota are saying, okay, we're willing to swallow hard and take on our responsibility for protecting the climate, and we expect everyone else up the chain to do the same thing. I was asked to speak today about something called the Minnesota Climate Change Advisory Group, what that is and where it's going, and then to take your questions. I'm going to step back from that just for a moment, just to remind you that what happened in the Minnesota legislature in 2007 is that 3 very significant pieces of energy legislation were passed that will begin to make a difference on climate change. And so we should all have that as a shared context going forward. The first thing the legislature did was to say we were going to join about 25 other states that already had renewable electricity standards or requirements for really ramping up our renewable energy penetration in our electric system. And Minnesota passed the strongest one in February, and it essentially calls for 25% of the state's electricity to come from new renewable energy by the year 2025, with varying levels for Xcel and other utilities. But compare that to my electric company now, which is Xcel, which today gets a little less than 4% of its electricity from renewable energy, from wind energy. So ramping up to 30% for Xcel by 2020. So that's a big difference. It's a big, what we call a down payment on reducing climate emissions and modernizing our energy system. So it's something we should all be proud of. The second thing the Minnesota legislature did that was totally without controversy, thankfully, as it should be, should have been done a long time ago, was to essentially triple the required investments of your electric and natural gas utilities in saving energy and energy efficiency. So essentially tripling those investments. So that will save all of us money, that will cut emissions everywhere. It's the fastest, cheapest, best way to fight climate change is to engage in energy efficiency and energy conservation. The third thing the legislature did that was highly controversial was to pass the Global Warming Mitigation Act. And that was tied together, thankfully, with the energy efficiency requirements. It moved through the legislature as one, thanks to the leadership of Representative Bill Hilty, who should be hugely thanked and honored everywhere you go. Because what he said is we're going to pass an energy bill that's going to include conservation, and it's going to include global warming protection, and we're going to move it as a unit. And by golly, he did move it as a unit. And nobody expected this bill to pass going into the 2007 legislative session. It is science-based. It says that the goals of the state of Minnesota going forward, economy-wide, are 80% reductions at least in emissions by the year 2050, 30% reductions at least by the year 2025, and 15% reductions at least by the year 2015. These are science-based. The fact that I'm saying at least is because as the science gets more and more certain that the climate is changing faster than we thought it would, it becomes clear that we need to make deeper and deeper reductions. So 15% by 2015, 30% by 2025, 80% by 2050. And that's on 2005 emissions, thank you. So based on 2005 emissions. That put Minnesota on the map, because before that time there was no state in the heartland that said we had goals like that. You had what I felt were irrelevant states. I'm from New York, maybe you can tell sometimes from my accent. And I have lots of friends in California, and there was action going on in New York, New Jersey, Maryland, Pennsylvania, up to the New England states. Very liberal states like Vermont, which don't make a difference to Minnesota. And then very liberal states like California, which again don't make a difference to Minnesota legislators. But when the state of Minnesota, now closely followed by the states of Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, Iowa, and even Kansas taking good climate protection steps, that's when Congress starts to pay attention. So you have these goals, which are nice. And I did actually get a call from one of my members who said, well, Jay, now that you passed that global warming bill, what are you going to do with your time? I've had to remind people all over the state that setting goals does not achieve the goals. And if you looked at emissions, I think in your city, I think in every state, they're increasing. So until those emissions start to go down, we have not turned the corner on this thing. And that's the only metric, that's the only measure that matters. Are emissions going up or are emissions going down? So that can really help us focus our attention. Now, around the same time that the legislature was passing these laws, Governor Tim Pawlenty set up the Minnesota Climate Change Advisory Group. And he invited into the state of Minnesota a nationally renowned nonprofit that's working in about 15 other states. They're called the Center for Climate Strategies. And they're funded primarily by come into the state and work with a group of stakeholders selected by the governor to figure out the best set of policies to recommend to the legislature about how to achieve those goals. Now that group, I'm one of the members appointed to that advisory group. I only accepted the appointment because I really strongly believe in the top two criteria that group is using. There are many ways you can fight climate change, but you should start, if you have deep reductions in front of you, you should start with those that get you the most tons of reduction at the lowest cost. So those are the two top criteria, ones that I personally and professionally very much believe in. I think there are 54 of us on the Climate Change Advisory Group. That's way too many people. You can take a look at the website, www.mnclimatechange.us. So it's a little different than your usual website, it's .us, mnclimatechange.us. For the fullest of members, it includes every industry I think that you can think of. It includes a few environmentalists. No one really from the consumer protection side that I have identified. It doesn't contain at least one mayor, Mayor Jamie Callison from Minnetonka, who's been very active, particularly on the transportation and land use groups. You may want to have her come to your community or talk to you privately. She's been very deeply engaged in this process, but she's only one mayor. And our charge is to do the modeling and figure out what is the best set of dozens of policies that the state could enact through executive order or through legislative action that would get us on a track to meeting those states' global warming goals. And in particular, we're looking at that midterm reduction goal, 30% by 2025. Because if you try to do economic modeling out beyond 2025, you're really just guessing. But you really need to get yourself on that performance track to meet those emissions reductions goals. It's also important to know that when the Minnesota Climate Change Advisory Group comes out with their recommendations, it is a report. It does not get the work done. The work gets done by executive order in some states. Our state does not have a strong history of using executive orders. We have a strong history of using the legislation to get things done. So we will still need to pass legislation. In particular, the group was advised by the legislature to take a strong look at regional cap and trade policies. So regional policies in our region or in a region by joining the New England states or the West Coast states to look at how can we act together to cap or limit emissions, cause them to go down over time, and do it in a way that does not give away the permits to pollute but auctions the right to pollute, and to make it as fair and equitable as possible. It's a lot of work. You may, after Philip speaks, you may have some more questions about this. But thank you very much for what you're doing. I cannot tell you how it is energizing legislators. We all have responsibility here. Our Congress people have responsibility. Our state legislators have responsibility. The governor does. But it really helps to have that driving momentum from communities around the state who are saying, we're stepping up to the plate. We're going to start reducing emissions, but we expect you to do that too. And one final thing. If you sign the U.S. Mayor's Climate Protection Agreement, you agreed to voluntarily try to meet Kyoto, but you also agreed to urge your state and federal legislators to enact bipartisan laws that would get us to emissions reductions. And Fresh Energy would love to work with all of you to figure out how we actually encourage the Minnesota legislature